All right. We're on a take two of this episode here. And I think this is actually a better time to do this episode because my dad did just visit over the weekend. So I have a fresher perspective on what his energy is like. And it always reminds me of my childhood now when I see him. But before I get into that, thanks everyone for watching. Please remember to like the video if you like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share my content with others that you think might benefit from learning a little bit about radical self respect. Normally we talk about relationships, mindset stuff. I like to do interviews here, and some of my supplement videos are also pretty popular. And my videos about cluster B girls and my dating experiences with them, they are also pretty popular as well. So check those out if you've had those kinds of experiences. And that kind of ties right in to today's topic because oftentimes when someone winds up with a cluster B girl, chances are one of their parents or both of their parents was part of a narcissistic slash codependent dynamic. And, that was it wasn't any different for me. Now, my dad, he wasn't necessarily very bad, but he was certainly strict and he certainly had his values and he certainly was very judgmental. And as we grow up, though, like there's two different kinds of sons I've noticed from fathers that are a little on the strict side, maybe slightly abusive or maybe a little narcissistic. Is there's the guys that they are really resentful of their fathers and they start to hate them and they wish that their father was more like their friends' fathers, that was more of just a friend and the guy that they could do things with and say anything to, etc. And they just look at how the other side, the grass was always greener. It would have been a lot better, they think, if our dad was like this person. And admittedly, for me, I did kind of think that way for a while myself. I was very resentful, and I did not like the upbringing I had for a while. It took me a while to get to a place where I really was okay with how I was brought up. And admittedly, I ran away. Like when I was growing up, especially into my teen years, I did not accept masculinity well. And I did not take criticism well. And I just kind of figuratively ran away. I ran off to drugs and drinking and fantasy land. And I kind of hid from the world of responsibility for a while. And, that was part of my path. It was part of my path. And I wouldn't be here today if not for all the things that I've done. And that kind of ties in also to where I am now with it. So, regardless of what our past is like, what I choose to have as my mindset today is what is the most pragmatically helpful way for me to look at this situation? And that's not always like wishing it could have been better. In fact, it's usually the opposite of that. Usually it's how do we reframe the scenario so that it best suits us today? Because ultimately, if we're trying to live our best lives today, that's what we got to do. We got to reframe things in a way that best suit us. Now, will I say this is always the best way to parent children? Not necessarily, but I think what we're about to find out here and what I'm going to talk about is it has its benefits for sure. And for me, I'm glad I was raised this way now. And it took me a while to get to this point, though. But here's the thing if we learn to like and love ourselves today, and we like who we've become, then we have to kind of also accept and be grateful for all the things that happened along the way to get to where we are now. And admittedly, this is a hard thing for a lot of people to get, especially for women. They don't see this side of it. But for men, to me, this is what we got to do. And I've learned some of this from Andrew Tate and how he talked about his father. And he said his father was a presence, and his father really pushed him. And his mother didn't really understand the burden of performance and said, "Oh, you should lighten up on him, lighten up on him." And his father was always like, "Well, excuses are not going to matter in the real world." And he's absolutely right about it. Excuses do not matter in the real world. We have to produce results. We have to be competent. And so his father pushed him and pushed him and pushed him. And lo and behold, he became a 4-time kickboxing champion. And that's the kind of thing that in this new age here, when I look around on Facebook, I look around on Twitter, Instagram, all the memes that I see. And side note, I'm going to create another series about memes, like kind of like a meme breakdown series, as opposed to kind of commenting on video or memes that I see and wasting my time. If I'm going to comment on something, I feel like I may as well make a video about it. But anyway, so when I'm in that frame of mind, I'm looking at like what's going on in those scenarios. Like men, we have to be competent. We have to kind of know what's the best thing to do. And we have to push through things regardless of how we feel. That's always going to be my definition of courage, doing the right thing regardless of how we feel. So back to the two different ways that sons interpret this. I ran away from it. I did not accept the masculinity well, and I hid. But as I grew and I learned from my experiences, and it's certainly tied into me being attracted to some cluster B girls too. But those are all the things that pushed me and helped me to become a better version of myself. And the things my dad really valued: hard work, being in shape and physical appearance. And just this past weekend, he said to me, "Jared, you're gaining weight." And I thought about it, and it kind of was like, it always stings a little bit when your father gives you a little criticism, because he is, he's judgmental for sure. And he likes to pick sometimes. But I looked at it and I was like, you know what? You're right. And I actually examined some of my diet, and I've realized I've been having a pretty unhealthy smoothie for myself every night, which I thought was real fruit. And it turns out it wasn't really, really fruit. It was more high fructose corn syrup. And so I'm going to remove that from my diet. And hopefully that helps me in the long run. But the point is, he mentioned that to me. And that's kind of how we were brought up. We were brought up to care about our physical appearance, to work really hard, and to do good things for others no matter what. And it was tough at the time. It absolutely was. It was certainly hard, and I didn't like it at the time. But only now that I've gotten to where I am now, and I think I'm finally in a good spot, I feel like things are better now. I'm glad that I had the upbringing I did. Of course, it wasn't perfect, but I'm glad I'm like who I am today. And if we like who we are, we kind of have to say to ourselves, hey, how we got here is how we got here. We have to accept all the things that happened to get to where we are today. Because the other side is the guy that's just going to complain about it, the guy who's going to be resentful about it and talk crap about his dad to everybody and whine and moan. And those are the guys, they're not accepting reality. They're not trying to look at it and reframe it in the best possible way for them. They're putting themselves in the victim mentality. And again, I'm all about what's going to be the most pragmatically helpful way to look at the situation. And to me, the most pragmatic way to look at the situation was, well, I got my hard work ethic from my dad. I got the care for my physical appearance from my dad. And, and other stuff too, very competitive. My dad was very competitive. I mean, I got that too. Now, of course, there's negatives in those things too, but I'm grateful that I was taught all of those lessons now. And it's not like fathers today, it seems like they're just a no one. Like they walk in the room and nothing even changes. But I think a father is supposed to be a presence. It's not supposed to be a dude that when he walks in the room, no one even notices. But like when my dad walks in the room, the presence is filled in the room. And I hated that as a kid. I tried to escape it and avoid it. And his presence bothered me. But it's because I wasn't ready. And perhaps, my dad didn't have the best emotional control as a younger man. And, he was teaching me these lessons, and he didn't always have emotional control about it. That was probably something that could have gone better. But the lessons still remain. And the lessons are, when you look at it the right way, then you're able to use all that stuff and look at the good things about yourself, and you realize how your dad helps you to be the way you are today. But I know people, though, that they can't look at it that way at all. They dislike their parents, they're resentful of them, and they're always whining and moaning about it and wishing it was different. But that doesn't help us today. How does that help anyone today? And the reality is it doesn't. And I see a lot of, especially younger people, they're just stuck. Like their mindsets are stuck in this vicious cycle of, I wish it was different. My dad was terrible. He was a jerk. He was this. He was that. Instead, they don't try to look at the good things because nothing or very little is all good or all bad. There's always going to be something to look at and say, you know what? There's some good stuff that happened in there too. There's opportunities in everything that's happened to us. And so if you're a kid, if you're a man and your father was like that, try to take the good from it because there probably was some good from it. And even if it's just, we get trauma from it, etc. I don't know too many interesting people that didn't have much trauma, that's for sure. And again, I'm glad I had the upbringing I did. Yeah, there's a little bit of trauma involved, no doubt. But it could be a hell of a lot worse. I still had a roof over my head. I still had food on the table. The lights were on. The bills were paid. Things could have been a hell of a lot worse. But my dad worked really hard. He worked the night shift, and so he was kind of cranky a lot. And, when he was cranky, he would get this bad temper. And his temper was kind of like he was an alcoholic, except he didn't drink. He never drank alcohol. But his temper was like that of one. And he was only doing the best that he could because his parents were alcoholics. And so he didn't really see healthy relationship dynamics. And a lot of his brothers had struggles with addictions. And so, he was like an adult child of an alcoholic. And he did the best he could with the knowledge that he had. And today we have just so much more knowledge about psychological issues, about narcissists, about codependency, about addiction, about emotional maturity, about boundaries. They're common now because we see them all the time on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, etc. But that was not common back then. Like that was rare. People were a little more unconscious back then. But there's pros and cons to that too. So they were a little more unconscious in their relationships, but a lot of them did certainly pair bond and they got husbands and wives and had kids and they had a home. And maybe it wasn't perfect, but they still created families and they still created, a lot of this millennial generation here. So it wasn't all bad. Every generation is going to have its pros and cons. It's just the way it is. So today we're much more conscious, but I think one of the things that happens when we become more conscious is we understand that they did the best they could with their understanding at the time. And yeah, it probably could have been better, but we got to take the good things from it. It wasn't all bad. And there was good things that happened in most of these scenarios. I'm never going to say all, but in most of these scenarios, there's good that we can pull from it. And we can say, okay, I got my hard work ethic from my dad. I got my competitiveness from my dad. And those are two things that have really helped me in my life as an adult. And I learned them from him. And so I got to be grateful for that. And I got to appreciate the lessons. And I'm not going to dwell on the crappy parts. Because sure, there's crappy parts. But what good does it do me to dwell on those now? It does me zero good. It does me zero good to dwell on those parts or complain about those parts or wish anything was different. I'm going to reframe this in a way that helps me today. It helps me to live my happiest, healthiest life today. And that's acceptance. It's acceptance of how things were, taking the good, learning from it, taking the opportunities from it, and being grateful for the good things that came of it. And that's it. And being grateful for having a dad that was willing to work all those hours to pay the bills and put food on the table. That's a good freaking thing. And I've been watching a lot of Kevin Samuels recently, and he makes it a point to mention that kind of stuff too. Because there's a lot of people that they get super entitled about things. And they say, oh, well, my dad he worked and he put food on the table and the bills were paid, but he wasn't emotionally available, or he wasn't this, or he wasn't that. And it's like, in the game of life, we're not going to have it all. It's not the perfect world. I don't like how people always focus on the negatives of it. And they whine and say, oh, how terrible their childhoods were and how toxic they were and how toxic their parents were. But, they were doing the best they could with what they had. I think that's part of acceptance, though. We got to accept, that's how it was. That's how it was then. What good does it do us now? And then How are we going to raise our kids going forward? That's another thing. I am going to try to be hard on my kid. I'm going to try to also, though, I'm going to try to have emotional control about it, though, too. Like, I'm going to try to teach tough lessons, but not like minus the abusive part, we'll say. But I'm still going to be tough on them. And it might feel like abuse to kids when you're being tough on them. That's for sure. And other kind of progressive folks may say something like, if you emotionally hurt your kid, you're traumatizing the kid. If you push them too hard, you're traumatizing them. It's like, well, sometimes you got to do stuff you don't want to do, especially as a man growing up. And where do you learn those lessons? You learn them as a kid first. And that's part of being an adult. This idea that we should never be uncomfortable and all bad feelings or all negative feelings should be avoided. It's just flat out wrong. It's wrong. It's like you want to prepare your kids for the road, not the road for the kid, right? To me, that's the way to go about it, and to empower our kids to do better. And that's kind of what my dad was trying to do for me. I just wasn't ready for it. I wasn't ready for it at the time. So, yeah, and that's kind of on me. And I could say, oh, well, I wish maybe he would have recognized it, but what good does it do me to think of that now? It doesn't do me any good. He did the best he could, and I learned some valuable lessons, and it's really helped me out in my adult life. And it took me a long time to be grateful for them, but I eventually did. I still learned to stop focusing on the negative parts, the parts that were a little more trauma-filled and probably contributed to other negative parts that have happened in my life. But again, I'm glad all the things happened the way they did. So I don't resent any of that. It just was part of my path, and I'm happy to be where I am with it today. So I'd had this video uploaded before, but it didn't really do as well. And so it's not good for the algorithm when something doesn't get too many views. So I got rid of it. But a couple people mentioned it to me that they wanted to watch it. So I decided to make it here again. So here it is. Again, if you got this far, please remember to like the video. If you like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you very much for watching.